I feel cheated. Let me explain. If you look in the Torah refers to Rosh Hashanah as a Yom Teruah, a day on which we blow the shofar. It seems to be that the shofar is the most important part of the day. In fact, this is reflected in halacha. The Shulchan Aruch says that if a person has a choice between going to a really great davening with a mediocre shofar blowing, or going to a really great shofar blowing with a mediocre davening, they should pick the really great shofar blowing, even if their davening isn't going to be so great, because the main part of the day isn't the davening, even though it's what we spend most of the day doing. The only mitzvah d'oraisa, the biblical obligation, is that of shofar blowing. That seems to be the most important. And yet, Chazal decided that when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, that we're not going to blow shofar at all, because we're scared that a person is going to carry the shofar outside of the Eruv, and that's a violation of Shabbos. So they said no shofar blowing on Shabbos, even though it's Rosh Hashanah. So I feel cheated. The most important part of the day was taken away from me. So what am I going to do tomorrow on Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah, in order to connect and get the most out of the day? So I want you to join me to the Mishnayos at the end of this third parak of Maseches Rosh Hashanah. The Mishnah there records the following case. A person is walking by a shul. They're not planning on going inside, they're just walking nearby the shul, and suddenly they hear that they're blowing shofar inside. So can that count as a person fulfilling their obligation of shofar blowing? The Mishnah says that if this person had kavana in kivin, if while he was walking by and heard the shofar blowing, he said, "Oh, I want this to count as my obligation," and yatsa, that works. V'im lo kivin, and if I didn't have kavana, he didn't have the intention that I want this to count as my shofar blowing, that didn't work, that didn't fulfill the shofar blowing. And the Mishnah should have ended there. But the Mishnah in Perek Gimel, Mishnah Zayin, and Masechet Rosh Hashanah adds on one more line that changes everything. The line is as follows. Af alpi shezeh shama v'zeh shama im kivin zeh kivin libo v'zeh lo kivin libo. Even if there are two guys who walk by, the exact same position at the exact same time, the two guys walked by, but one of them had kavana and one of them did not have kavana. The first guy who intended to fulfill his obligation, he fulfilled his obligation, and the second guy who did not intend to fulfill the obligation, even though he heard the shofar blowing in the exact same way as the first guy, it didn't work. Lo yatsa, he didn't fulfill his obligation. This extra, seemingly unnecessary line of the Mishnah teaches us something super deep about shofar blowing. That the main part of shofar blowing isn't about hearing the shofar, but it's about your intention, you internalizing it, you making it a part of you. This idea is reflected in the next Mishnah, the final Mishnah in the third parak of Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Mishnah Chet. I'm not going to read it inside, but it records the following cases from the Torah. Back when Bnei Yisrael were fighting with Amalek, and it was an intense battle. Amalek was a really strong nation. The Torah says that whenever Moshe raised his hands in the sky, Bnei Yisrael started winning. And whenever Moshe lowered his hands, Bnei Yisrael started losing. And the Mishnah says, how is it possible to think that Moshe Rabbeinu had magical hands? That suddenly when his hands were in the sky, that gave the Jewish people magical strength? No, that's not what's going on. Rather, whenever Moshe Rabbeinu lifted up his hands, Bnei Yisrael looked at Moshe's hands, and they were looking upwards, and they thought of Hashem, and they dedicated their hearts to Hashem, and that is what led them to succeed. When Moshe dropped his hands, they weren't thinking about Hashem as much, and they weren't succeeding. The same thing the Mishnah says happens back in Parshat Chukat, when Bnei Yisrael were traveling in the desert, and they started complaining, and Hashem sends these poisonous snakes to bite the people, and they were all getting really sick, and Moshe wants to daven on their behalf, and Hashem says, make this copper snake and hold it up in the air, and whoever looks at the copper snake, they're going to be healed. So again, is it possible that this copper snake has magical healing powers? No, of course. Rather, what Hashem was saying is when you lift this copper snake in the air, Bnei Yisrael will look upwards towards the copper snake, and they're going to think of me up in the Shamayim, and once they direct their hearts towards Hashem, they're going to be healed. Otherwise, if they don't think about Hashem, they're not going to be healed. What this Mishnah is doing, randomly seemingly, in the middle of Rosh Hashanah, even though it has no connection to Rosh Hashanah, is telling us what the mitzvah of shofar is all about. Rav Yehuda Amital explains as follows, that just like we have Moshe's hands and this copper snake, which themselves don't have power, but they are symbols to get us to internalize HaKadosh Baruch Hu and direct and subjugate our hearts to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The same thing is true with the shofar. The shofar is only a tool, a means to get us to an end. When we listen to the shofar blast, it isn't the shofar blast that is doing magical things and connecting us to Hashem, but it is rather the shofar which causes us to introspect and think about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and subjugate and devote our hearts to service of Hashem. And therefore, yes, even though shofar is the most ideal way of performing the subjugation and connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, once in a while, such as when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, we don't have the opportunity to listen to the shofar. But that doesn't mean we can't fulfill the goal of shofar, which is connecting our hearts to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're still able to do this in our own way, be it through tefillah, be it through a lot of deep thought and thinking. It may not be ideal, but it's still something that we can do on the Shabbos to connect us and fulfill that goal of Rosh Hashanah. So even though we can't actually hear the shofar, the Torah in another place calls Rosh Hashanah a zichrun trua, a remembrance of the shofar, which Chazal tell us in the Yerushalmi means that when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos and we can't actually hear the shofar, we have to remember the message of the shofar and what the goal is, and try to replicate that message on this day when we cannot hear the shofar. So Mir Hashem, we should all have a Shana Tova, a Ktiva v'Chatima Tova, and a day where we're able to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and hopefully that'll lead to a year filled with happiness and health and really great avodat Hashem. Bye everyone.